Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we take a look at the famous King's Gambit opening, which begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and pawn to f4. With this aggressive pawn sacrifice, White is trying to open lines and seize control of the center as quickly as possible. But if Black has done his homework, he shouldn't have too many problems getting an interesting and balanced position against the King's Gambit. Let's take a look. With the opening move, pawn to e4, White is hoping to seize dominance in the center with the follow-up move, d2 to d4. And both of Black's most popular replies, c5, the Sicilian, and e5, the King's Pawn game, are directed against this plan. After the move e5, White's most classical plan is to play knight to f3, and over the long term, he plans to resume his aim of bringing a pawn to d4, usually by first playing the move c2 to c3. But White has a radically different approach available on move 2 with the move pawn to f4. And this is the distinguishing move of the King's Gambit. As you can see here, at the moment the f4 pawn is undefended, so that if Black simply takes on f4 with e takes f4, accepting the Gambit, Black can actually remain up a pawn for quite some time. But White reasons that his long-term ability to achieve a powerful central duo with d2 to d4 will fully compensate for this loss. Another main point for White here is that if he manages to regain the pawn on f4 without too many problems, he will achieve an excellent attacking position since the f-file has been opened up in advance and White will have a full central presence. But as they say, a pawn is a pawn. And in this position, Black is going to spend some time either holding on to the pawn, or he'll use the extra time which White devotes in recapturing the pawn to counterattacking in the center. Another big downside to White's strategy in this position is that f2 to f4 has somewhat weakened the King's position, and in this case, it has made the King vulnerable to the check on h4. And it's this factor which somewhat restricts White's options in the King's Gambit. For example, if he was to play the move d2 to d4 immediately, a very attractive move on its own right, he would instantly encounter queen h4 check when he will lose his castling rights, and he'll have to bring the king to this awkward square on e2, where it interferes with development and is vulnerable to an immediate attack. Instead, after pawn takes pawn on f4 accepting the Gambit, White's main move is knight to f3, preventing the check and adding support for a later d2 to d4 move. Now, Black has a few interesting ideas here, but the oldest and most traditional main line is the aggressive pawn to g5, defending the f4 pawn and creating the threat of pawn to g4, followed by that check which we just saw on h4. For example, if White was once again to play the move pawn to d4, Black could simply follow up with the strong move pawn to g4, so in this position, White is immediately faced with a serious task. In fact, two moves have been played quite often here. And one idea here is the move bishop to c4, in which White intends to play a dramatic piece sacrifice. After the move g4, which we said creates serious problems for White in this position, White's response is actually to simply castle kingside, offering a full piece on f3, and this is known as the Muzio Gambit. After the moves pawn takes knight on f3 and queen takes f3, we reach an extremely interesting position in which White has sacrificed an entire piece for several tempi in development. And if you look for a moment, you'll realize that Black has not developed a single piece in this position. So he not only needs to figure out how to bring his pieces into the game, but he also needs to, at the same time, focus on fending off this violent attack. And if you pay close attention here, you'll also notice that White is starting to build up serious pressure on the f7 point if only he can play the move queen takes f4. Since Black has no intention of letting White play queen takes f4 without a fight, Black's main move here is queen to f6. And Black simply demands that queens be traded in the event of a capture on f4. Now, right away, you're probably asking what happens if White simply continues to build this attack on f4 with the move d3, adding the dark squared bishop to the attack on f4. And in this case, I think it's quite simple for Black to simply play bishop to h6, continuing to make it difficult for White to recover his pawn without accepting some exchange of pieces. And remember that exchanges of pieces are always bad, or typically bad, when you're down in material. So this is definitely not to white's advantage, this kind of situation. So, believe it or not, white's main idea is to continue to sacrifice more material in this position with the move pawn to e5, exclamation point. Queen takes pawn on e5, and now another sacrifice. Bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and another sacrifice, pawn to d4, with the idea that if black takes this pawn on d4, white will play bishop to e3. And the whole point of this position is just to reach this amazingly complicated position where, yes, black is ahead 2 pawns, but he's going to come under severe attack very quickly. Sadly, the details of this position are a topic for another day, but judging by recent games, the modern opinion is that while black should be okay here, white has a surprising amount of compensation for his material. This is a very double-edged position with big winning chances for both sides. Backing up to the position after bishop c4, the Muzio gambit is a very interesting idea for white. However, fortunately for black, it's actually not too difficult to avoid. And modern players have begun to prefer this simplistic move, bishop to g7, just getting a little development going in the position. And now after the move pawn to d4, black responds with d6, restraining that pawn duel, disallowing that pawn duel from having maximum flexibility in this position. And now often, black, over the long term, will probably play h6, shoring up this pawn chain, and just holding on to that extra pawn for as long as he possibly can, and making it very difficult for white. At the same time, white still has to pay attention to the fact that this little move, g4, could take place at any time. In my opinion, this is a much safer way for black to reach an imbalanced position, which still offers us some slight problems for white. So much for bishop to c4. The other critical move in this position is pawn to h4. And by moving a pawn to the key square on h4, white cleverly ensures that after this standard move, pawn to g4 and knight e5, black does not have his check on h4 since the rook now covers the h4 square. Furthermore, the kingside pawns are now rather loose, as the g4 pawn is attacked 2 times, and the f4 pawn has also lost its support. However, once black makes peace with the fact that white shouldn't have too much difficulty recovering the sacrificed pawn, he's free to look for ways to pursue a counterattack in the center. There are still a few factors working in black's favor. Firstly, black can consider a rapid attack on the currently unprotected e4 pawn. Also, since white will probably eventually take on g4, black can prepare rook g8, exploiting the newly opened file. Now, one critical book line for black here is the surprising move pawn to d6. And with d6, black is making no effort to preserve the extra pawn on the king side, but is instead looking for piece activity. So after the move knight takes g4, black continues knight f6. The knights quite often exchange on f6, and we reach an interesting position where black is no longer ahead a pawn, but all of his pieces have very good scope in this position. For example, the g file is open and looks very attractive for the rook, and the queenside pieces have very little difficulty getting deployed. Perhaps knight to c6, and the bishop may make its way out to g4, especially if we get this rook on g8. Also, the queen is in a secure and active location on f6. White still has problems achieving this move d2 to d4, since in this case, black would get excellent counterplay with the move knight to c6. It's definitely not in white's interest to advance this pawn to d5, since this would give the knight a very attractive square on e5 with attacking chances in this position. Instead, white would have to play something more natural like c3 or bishop to b5, but then rook g8 will be an excellent reaction, and black has a very comfortable game going ahead. So, white normally does not play the move d4, but he instead plays knight to c3, and this leads to a highly unclear position with about equal chances for both sides. Backing up to the position after knight e5, a more aggressive strategy for black in this position is to play the move knight to f6, and this is with the idea of creating counterplay against the e4 pawn. So after the move knight takes g4, which is probably not a good idea in this position, black can simply play knight takes e4. And not only does this allow black to preserve his extra pawn, but it also means that the knight is very close to this attractive square on g3. Now, for example, if white simply plays the move pawn to d3, well, this knight has no trouble reaching the g3 square, knight g3. And the move queen to e2 is also not any real use, since black simply plays queen e7, and once again, white will have to contend with the possibility of the knight appearing on g3. In fact, it turns out that the move knight takes g4 is simply a poor reply to our move knight f6. Another tempting reply to knight f6 is d4, grabbing more central control and building an attack on the f4 pawn. But here too, black is going to get a great game with the move d6. And not only does this move push the knight back, but it also gives us a second defender of the g4 pawn, which means that white simply has to retreat, knight d3, and now black continues. Knight takes e4, bishop takes f4, bishop g7, c3, and black simply castles kingside. Now, black's pawn structure on the kingside may look a little overextended, and this is probably true, but black has successfully preserved his extra pawn, and white is actually slightly behind in kingside development. Thus, this line too ends up quite nicely for black. In my opinion, and in the theory opinion, there's only one really strong move for white in this position, and that is the move bishop to c4, beginning an attack on f7. Now black has to know the recipe to reach a decent position, and that recipe goes pawn to d5, blocking the bishop's diagonal, and returning the pawn back to white, so that after pawn takes pawn on d5, black now simply continues with his development bishop d6, developing very rapidly. And finally, after d4, black needs to be sensitive to the fact that white has opened up an attack on f4 pawn, and so black defends his pawn with this slightly unusual move, knight to h5. Once again, we've reached an unclear position, but once again I think that black has some reasons to be happy here, since his pieces are very actively placed. His kingside pawns are a little vulnerable, but with careful play, there should be winning chances in this position for both white and for black. I hope you've enjoyed some of these wild and crazy positions in the King's Gambit. If you play the King's Gambit with white, you're in for quite a ride. On the one hand, you may achieve some of the complicated and interesting sacrificial positions where you might get a juicy attack with white with sacrifices. However, if you're not careful, you may also just simply end up down a pawn or even down a full piece in certain cases. As always, a little homework will go a long way towards defeating your opponents. That's all for today, and see you next time.